In today's lesson, we'll be discussing Cold War politics. Our essential question: what methods did the United States use in its global struggle against the Soviet Union? I told you before that 1949 was a critical year in the Cold War. Not only did China fall to the communist rebels and the most populous nation in the world came under a communist regime, but also the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had developed an atomic bomb. For many Americans, this was a frightening bit of news. It also had the effect of setting off an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The arms race refers to both nations competing to build more powerful weapons, to have the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons and also the most powerful. In 1952, just 7 years after the development of the atomic bomb, the United States developed a hydrogen bomb that had 1,000 times more power than the atomic bomb. So we remembered the destruction that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic bomb was dropped. The hydrogen bomb was 1,000 times more powerful. It only took 1 year for the Soviets to also develop that capability, and they had a hydrogen bomb in their arsenal as well. So within the United States, we followed the policy of mutually assured destruction. The Soviet Union also adopted this policy. Mutually assured destruction, you may have noticed that the letters spell MAD, it's kind of a crazy idea, is the policy where the United States and the Soviet Union hope to avoid nuclear war by creating more and more nuclear weapons. All right, you build up enough weapons to completely destroy the other, and that will deter nuclear war from breaking out. All right, we can see down here in this cartoon, both of these nations have atomic weapons, but they are still using old school military techniques. John Foster Dulles was Eisenhower, his Secretary of State. Eisenhower is the president that followed Truman. His administration was also critical in the first few years of the Cold War. John Foster Dulles, as we can see, Time Man of the Year during Eisenhower's presidency, favored a policy of massive retaliation. This means that we would respond to communist threats by using overwhelming force, including our nuclear weapons. All right, this is what we told our communist rivals. This includes the Soviet Union and China, who was attempting to spread communist ideology through Asia. So we said, hey, if you attack any of our allies or any non-communist nations and try to turn them communist, we will retaliate against you to the highest possible level. John Foster Dulles also favored the policy of brinkmanship. This is the idea that only by going to the brink of war, of like constantly sitting on the edge of war and making that known to our enemies, that we could protect ourselves against communist aggression. All right, if we make the Soviet Union and China scared of what we will do if they are attempting to spread communism, then they won't spread communism. So all of this is still critical parts of containment policy. All right, responding to communist threats and holding off communist aggression by constantly sitting on the brink of war. You can also imagine what this did to the daily lives of Americans. There was a constant threat of nuclear war, nuclear annihilation that existed during the 1950s. Here's John Foster Dulles in 1955. The ability to get to the verge without getting into the war is the necessary art. If you are scared to go to the brink, you are lost. We also saw some military changes under Eisenhower's leadership. You'll remember that Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander of D-Day. He was a high-ranking general within the United States military. And because of this, he had insight into the future of war. He understood that war was changing. So, overall, he reduced the size of the military, but he increased the size of the Navy and the Air Force. The thought was that we will use our ships and our planes to carry our bombs across the world. We will focus on building up bombs and planes and submarines in case of nuclear war. So this provided a bigger bang for the buck for American taxpayers because he actually decreased spending of the military by $15 billion by focusing it only where it was truly necessary. In 1953, Stalin died. However, this did not mark the end of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry. Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. And even though he wanted a more peaceful coexistence between the Soviet Union and the United States, he was still dedicated to spreading communist ideology. He was still an opponent of the United States, and he was known for saying, "I can prophesy that your children will live under socialism," another term for communism. So, it is clear that the Soviet Union is still set on spreading communist ideology around the world. Once Khrushchev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union, him and Eisenhower meet at a conference in Switzerland with the goal of decreasing tensions between these two nations. At the same time, another part of the world is coming under the communist threat. We've already talked about Europe and what we did there. We talked about Asia and our containment policy there. Now we're talking about the Middle East. The Eisenhower Doctrine said that the United States would use force to help any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. You'll remember that the creation of Israel happened after World War II in the 1940s. Whenever the United States recognized Israel and became an ally of Israel, this angered many Arab countries within the Middle East. So, in retaliation, they began aligning themselves with the Soviet Union. So the Middle East was a big battleground for the Cold War. All right, will these nations fall in line with the Soviet Union, or will they fall in line with us? So we are expanding our American influence to spread capitalism and democracy. Under the Eisenhower Doctrine, Eisenhower sent American troops to Lebanon in 1958 to put down a revolt against a pro-American government. So we are actively intervening in the Middle East as well to prevent the spread of communism. The CIA was also developed in the early years of the Cold War. It was created because of the Cold War. It was created as an intelligence gathering organization, most specifically to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union. Under Eisenhower's leadership, the CIA takes on new responsibilities. All right, the CIA begins conducting secret operations around the world to protect American interests. What is the main American interest in the 1950s? Preventing the spread of communism. So we begin secretly but actively intervening in other nations' politics and in their elections to make sure that their governments remain friendly to the United States. What this means is that often the United States was putting down popular rebellions of the people, reversing the elections of popularly elected leaders who may have been open to communism or socialism. And oftentimes we were installing dictators that, though they were friendly to the United States, they were brutal rulers within their own country. So it was during this time that we made a lot of international enemies. A lot of nations still criticize us for our roles in meddling with their internal affairs throughout the Cold War. One place specifically, two places that we did this was in Iran. Iran was especially important for protecting the flow of oil to the United States. We undid the elections of the people of Iran and reinstalled a dictator who was friendly to us. And we also intervened in Guatemala. Many places within Latin America, we were intervening during this time. So the question becomes, we did this because we were in the midst of the Cold War, and containment of communism was our number one goal. But is this our responsibility or our right? Is this something that the United States should be doing? Should these actions have been taken by the United States in the past? So in the early years of the Cold War, even though we had experienced the loss of China, containment policy was working pretty well. Something happens in 1957, though, that shocks the United States. In 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched a satellite into orbit around the Earth, the first country to do so. This was especially shocking to the United States because we didn't have the technology to do this yet. We didn't know how. This also brings up the fear that with the use of satellites, the Soviet Union would be able to strike us with a nuclear weapon from space. This first satellite that was launched in 1957 was named Sputnik. A month later, they launched a larger satellite with a dog aboard. Leica was the name of the dog, and she did die in orbit. There was not a plan to bring her back alive. Americans were concerned that the Soviet Union's technology had surpassed ours. So this sets off a space race. The space race was a series of working on technology, dealing with space, with the ultimate goal of being the first country to put a man on the moon, a race that we ultimately won. Here's some pictures of Leica, the astronaut dog. In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act. This allocated $1 billion to produce more scientists and science teachers. This provided loans to institutions to continue education in science and also to individuals who wanted to pursue a career in science. The reason for this, the reason why we are willing to spend $1 billion is we have to be superior to the Soviets. We have to have the brightest and the best scientists on our side. In 1958, we also created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration that you know as NASA. So NASA was created to coordinate between scientists and the military and to conduct missions in space. We wanted to do more than what the CIA was capable of with gathering intelligence. We wanted to see what the Soviet Union was doing. In the 1950s, we began flying spy planes over the Soviet Union in order to capture photographs of their technological capabilities. All right, we wanted to see what was happening on the ground in the Soviet Union. In May of 1960, the Soviet Union shot down one of our planes. At first, we tried to say that it was a weather plane, that we had the right to be there because we were just conducting weather experiments. However, the pilot of that plane was captured. His name was Francis Gary Powers, and he was detained in a Soviet prison as a prisoner of war. This became known as the U-2 incident. After his capture, there was a negotiation to conduct a spy swap that was successful. Francis Gary Powers was brought back to the United States in exchange for a Soviet spy that was found in the United States, able to go back to the Soviet Union. However, the main effect of the U-2 incident was a worsening of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The progress that was made between Eisenhower and Khrushchev was almost immediately squashed.